Good day, everyone. My name is Kerry Leisha, and welcome to X-Africa's latest webcast. In today's presentation, we're going to be looking at the novel coronavirus, otherwise known as COVID-19, and its impact on country risk in Africa. But before we do, let's begin by briefly looking at COVID-19 in Africa today. The first confirmed COVID-19 case in all of Africa was reported in Egypt on Valentine's Day. 2.5 months later, and there are more than 30,000 cases across the continent, with around 1,500 deaths and almost 10,000 recoveries. As you can see from the GIF on the slide, confirmed COVID cases have largely been reported in Northern and South Africa to date. There are two main reasons for this. Firstly, these are the more developed regions of the continent, which means they remain more integrated with the rest of the world, likely leading to an earlier outbreak. But more importantly, and secondly, these are the regions with the most advanced testing facilities. At the beginning of the outbreak, many African countries did not have the testing capabilities and relied on external support for this. Many of you will recall the donations of hundreds of thousands of testing kits from Jack Ma at the beginning of the month, for example. While a lack of testing continues to pose a major problem for tracking COVID-19 in Africa today, beyond Northern and South Africa, the map is also giving us a clue as to where the next hotspot is going to emerge in the coming weeks. And this is, of course, West Africa, whilst East Africa continues to lag behind. Let's now dive into the distribution of cases in Africa by looking at individual countries. As depicted in the pie chart on the screen, it is clear that Northern and South Africa drive the majority of cases across the continent today. This is demonstrated through the concentration of cases in South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, and Algeria on the right-hand side of the screen. Most interestingly, South Africa and Egypt have actually trailed each other closely throughout this pandemic, with the two countries recording the almost exact level of cases compared to each other day by day. As of the 26th of April, for example, South Africa had 4,546 cases, whilst Egypt had 4,534. However, it is worth noting here that Egypt registered its first case weeks before South Africa did, and only moved into lockdown after South Africa. Some reporting from Western media has suggested that Egypt is actually covering up its number of cases and that there has been a lack of transparency from government in this regard. The Guardian, for example, has argued that Egypt had around 20,000 cases in mid-March already, which would have placed it as a bigger hot zone than parts of Europe and North America at the time. Moving away from Northern Africa, the next highest concentration of cases in the continent are clearly found in West Africa. This is demonstrated through countries such as Cameroon, Ghana, Nigeria, and Côte d'Ivoire on the left-hand side of the screen. Breaking these cases down day by day, beginning in early March, we get to see a number of other trends. First and foremost, we can see the dominance of South Africa and Egypt, highlighted in pink and green on the graph. Other countries that are rising sharply are clearly Algeria and Morocco. These are highlighted in dark red and dark blue on the graph. Following on from our previous slide, you can see that Egypt also registered its first COVID-19 case well before South Africa did. Towards the bottom right-hand corner of the graph, we can see West African countries starting to report more and more cases from the beginning of April, demonstrating that this is the new emerging hotspot for the continent. There's about a 2-week lag here between Northern and South Africa and West Africa, although it's very important to reiterate that cases in West Africa are likely to be much higher. Nevertheless, all of the countries depicted on this graph are on an upward trajectory, although some have largely flattened their curve, demonstrating that we are very much at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa. Having had a look at how these cases are currently distributed in Africa, let's briefly turn to how African countries have responded to the crisis. In this regard, African countries have moved swiftly to go into lockdown at the start of the pandemic, especially when compared to Western nations. The map on the screen shows the number of lockdowns across the continent as of early April, demonstrating that Africa acted quickly to close its borders and implement travel restrictions. South Africa, the country with one of the highest concentrations of busiest airports in Africa, for example, went into a complete nationwide lockdown exactly 3 weeks after its first case was reported, with around 500 cases and no deaths at the time. In comparison, Italy began its national lockdown around 6 weeks after its first case was reported, and at a time when there were around 9,000 cases and nearly 5,000 deaths in the country. The majority of African countries remain in lockdown today, although a number are considering how to ease restrictions going forward. Now that we have an understanding of where COVID-19 has made landfall in Africa over the past couple of weeks, let's now get to the heart of this presentation and look at how the virus is affecting country risk across the continent. Up on the screen, we have Ex-Africa's latest overall country risk ratings for Africa, recently revised by our team on the 1st of April 2020. Ex-Africa's overall country risk ratings are based on 10 individual risk perils for each country that take into account the local political, economic, and security environment over a forecasted one-year outlook for each country. Individual factors that are considered in this regard include economic volatility, the risk of a sovereign default, political instability, strikes, riots, and civil commotion, and war and terrorism, among other perils. As you can see in our latest risk scoring map on the screen, which has been defaulted to the highest risk peril, a large number of countries are currently assessed as having a high or severe country risk rating over the coming months. These countries are highlighted in orange and red on the screen. This trending towards higher risk ratings across the continent is primarily as a result of COVID-19, as well as the drop in the oil price this year. To get a better understanding of why this is the case, let's now have a look at how the virus can impact the economic, political, and security health of individual countries over the long term. Beginning with the economic impact of the virus, it's useful for us to recall the state of many African economies before COVID-19 made landfall. By looking at the state of African debt, for example, the robustness of many African economies was in question at the start of the year because of unsustainable levels of debt. While debt as a percentage of GDP had been stabilizing in some African countries for some time, at the start of the year, several sovereigns remained at risk of a major financing shock in 2020 and 2021, and this was before COVID-19. Notably, Moody's Investor Services noted in February already that countries like the Republic of Congo, Mozambique, and Zambia were the most exposed to credit risks. Other countries like Ghana, Angola, and Kenya were also deemed to be highly vulnerable at the time, as were, of course, Sudan, Eritrea, Libya, and Zimbabwe. Fast forward just a few months or weeks, and we have the twin effects of COVID-19 and the dramatic drop in the oil price hitting the continent. These two charts on the screen hint to the challenges the continent has faced in just the first quarter of 2020. On the left-hand side of the screen, we can see that the first quarter has been marked by a dramatic rise in continental COVID-19 cases that is only expected to get worse over the long term. On the right-hand side of the screen, we can see the unprecedented collapse in the price of oil, which is in some part related to the virus, something that will not be discussed in this presentation. Taken together, these two effects are expected to wreak havoc on Africa's economy. The World Bank's latest biannual report that was released in April, for example, has predicted that Africa's economies will now tip into recession for the first time in 25 years this year. It forecasts that real GDP growth of sub-Saharan Africa will now reduce to around -2% for this year, with the potential for it to drop to -5.1%. This is a dramatic turnaround from the previous outlook for Africa for 2020, where it was forecasted that the continent would grow by 2.9% this year. The World Bank attributes this to 1. The disruption of trade and value chains, 2. The disruption of financing flows and remittances, 3. The public health emergency threat that is facing the workforce, and 4. The effects of coercive economic lockdowns across the continent. With high levels of public debt and economic recession on the cards, the main question now is just how is Africa going to finance its response to COVID-19? Indicative of the mammoth financial layout ahead, the UN has estimated that Africa needs more than $200 billion to respond to this pandemic and mitigate its economic impact. Of this, $100 billion is needed immediately to resource social systems. To date, this gap has largely been filled by multilateral institutions. In particular, the World Bank, IMF, and the African Development Bank have largely filled these gaps, as demonstrated on the screen. However, while these institutions have helped to plug this financial gap, the big elephant in the room concerns the continent's debt. To this end, African finance ministers have repeatedly sounded calls for debt relief to help them in their fight against COVID-19. Indeed, financing debt at a time when the continent needs to boost internal social systems seems almost inhumane. The continent owes around $44 billion on interest payments in 2020 alone, for example. This is around a quarter of the financial amount needed to combat COVID-19. Despite these calls, individual countries have not supported bilateral debt relief, including the likes of the US, China, and India. This is despite the fact that Chinese debt comprises a significant portion of many of Africa's largest economies. Lending from China makes up around 33% of external debt in Kenya, 17% in Ethiopia, and 10% in Nigeria, suggesting that unless some debt servicing arrangement is not made, these countries, along with many others across the continent, will struggle to meet the financial obligations required to combat COVID-19 over the long term, even despite the support from multilateral lenders. Let's now turn our attention to how COVID-19 may impact political stability across the continent, starting with its impact on elections. 2020 was always going to be a big election year in Africa, with at least 22 countries scheduled to vote in some way or form. Notably, 13 of these were for the positions of president or prime minister, so there were going to be significant votes. Whether these elections take place in most of these countries will now depend on how long individual states take to contain COVID-19. While this is of course uncertain, what is clear is that in response to COVID-19, at least 40 governments in Africa have implemented movement restrictions, 26 have declared states of emergency or states of disaster, and in at least 20 African countries, some of the measures implemented are indefinite. All of these measures are nevertheless expected to impact elections in one way or form. In some instances, elections have actually proceeded, such as in Mali, which held its first parliamentary elections since 2013 over this past month. Unsurprisingly, voter turnout was at a record low, with a turnout of just 12.9% in the capital city. Yet because there is no minimum voter turnout for election results to be valid in Mali, the results have been accepted, despite widespread criticism. Another country that pushed through elections over the last month is Guinea, which went to the polls in late March to elect members of parliament and vote on a proposed constitutional reform. These elections were held against a backdrop of street protests and despite the threat of the coronavirus pandemic. A similar outcome is now expected in Burundi next month. Across the continent, Ethiopia took a different approach and has decided to delay its much-anticipated elections that were scheduled for August. While this has been welcomed by the opposition in the country, in other locations in Africa, heads of states may choose to delay the vote to their strategic advantage. This is likely in Malawi, which is scheduled to hold a rerun of its election in July. But because the incumbent is expected to be unseated in the vote, he is likely to postpone the vote to stay in power, using coronavirus to his advantage. Somalia's elections are also likely to be postponed, much to the dismay of local leaders this year. In each of these cases, the holding or delaying of elections during COVID-19 may ultimately be used to the advantage of political leaders. And such exploitation of the system during a time of crisis has the potential to spark civil unrest and ultimately threaten political instability. Beyond the impact on elections, COVID-19 poses a very real threat to the highest levels of government. Africa's political leaders are naturally exposed to the virus, as they are more likely to have frequented travel hubs and met with delegates from high-risk countries. Protracted self-isolation and hospitalization for treatment of these leaders is therefore likely to disrupt the functions of many African governments, but particularly those governments where decision-making is highly centralized around a single figure. To this end, Ex-Africa has identified several countries whose political systems remain the most vulnerable to disruption in terms of decision-making and policy-making should top figures contract the virus. Such countries include Equatorial Guinea, where President Obiang has been in power for 41 years, allowing him to centralize his power. While the president's son is already the favorite to succeed in the event of a crisis, he himself could face a challenge from other family members in this instance, raising the risk of political instability at the highest levels. Cameroon is in a similar position, as President Biya has been in power for 38 years. Any disruption to the centralization of power could also spark power struggles within the ruling party, by the military, and possibly even aggravate the country's civil war in its Anglophone regions, raising multiple risks in the country at the same time. Nigeria is also at risk. While the country remains a democracy, we have nevertheless seen the virus impact the country's innermost political circles following the death of the president's chief of staff earlier this month. President Buhari himself also has a history of seeking medical treatment abroad for protracted reasons, suggesting that ruling figures in this country remain highly vulnerable. Other countries with vulnerable political leadership, either because of a centralization of power around a single figure or an ongoing contestation of power in the country, include Côte d'Ivoire, Egypt, Gabon, Guinea, Malawi, Morocco, Namibia, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. Having reviewed how COVID-19 can impact the economic and political health of countries, let's now turn our attention to our final country risk consideration by looking at the virus's impact on security. First and foremost, over the last few weeks, we have already witnessed how non-state actors, such as Islamist militant groups and insurgent groups, have tried to exploit the pandemic to their advantage through a number of brazen attacks. Over the course of just 2 days in March, we saw 2 unprecedented attacks take place in 2 very different corners of the continent. Firstly, Islamist militants in northern Mozambique briefly seized a strategic port in the gas-rich northern regions of the country, in without a doubt the most brazen and sophisticated attack by the group to date. Secondly, the Boko Haram militant group staged an attack around Lake Chad in which 92 Chadian soldiers were killed. This incident marked the deadliest attack against Chadian forces to date. It is worth noting that Islamist militant groups are not the only actors that have looked to exploit the pandemic to their advantage. In Libya, as the year anniversary of military commander Khalifa Haftar's offensive against Tripoli passed in April, conflict in the capital only worsened as Haftar continued his siege. Despite repeated calls for a ceasefire in Libya to allow healthcare workers to respond to the pandemic, heavy shelling in Tripoli has been reported, including against local hospitals. Such brazen attacks are likely to continue in the coming weeks and months as non-state actors attempt to use the virus to gain a strategic and operational advantage in the continent's conflict zones. At the same time, however, the rapid spread of COVID-19 has also hindered the ability of regional and international stakeholders to maintain momentum around peace agreements and the deployment of security forces in Africa. In response to the pandemic, the African Union's Peace and Security Council decided to suspend its work until at least mid-April, for example. Yet key issues on its agenda included major mediation initiatives such as the implementation of the peace agreement in South Sudan. The deployment of security forces to conflict zones has further been affected by the pandemic. All rotations and new deployments to the AU mission in Somalia have been suspended, for example. A similar halt on rotations has also been reported in the Sahel, whilst the deployment of foreign troops to the region is now expected to be delayed. In this regard, where 250 British troops were scheduled to join the effort against violent extremists later this year in the Sahel, this is now likely to be put on the back burner. Other peace agreements that are likely to be affected over the coming year include a resolution of the dispute between Kenya and Somalia and a ceasefire and peace agreement in Libya, a former priority for Berlin and Brussels. As such, without forward movement on peace agreements and the maintenance of security forces on the continent, a major security vacuum may actually emerge over the coming weeks as COVID-19 sweeps through Africa's conflict zones. Having had a look at how country risk in Africa may be impacted by the arrival of COVID-19, let's now take a look at the 10 countries we think are the most at risk in this regard. As COVID-19 has continued to spread, we at Ex-Africa decided to formulate our own country risk vulnerability model to assess which countries are most at risk of COVID-19. This complements our normal country risk rating methodology, which I showed you in one of our earlier slides. Taking into account all of the economic, political, and security factors that I have already discussed, in addition to other social considerations, we believe the 10 countries listed on the screen are the most vulnerable to COVID-19 in terms of country risk. Recalling some of the issues we have already discussed, there are a number of clear and unsurprising trends across all of these countries. Firstly, many of them have a high level of debt. These include Sudan, Eritrea, and Burundi. Secondly, many of them are oil economies, meaning they are facing the twin effects of COVID-19 and a collapse of the oil market. These include Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, and Sudan. Thirdly, many of these countries have politically sensitive situations as a result of upcoming elections or centralized regimes that hinder political or policy continuity. These include Nigeria, Somalia, Burkina Faso, Lesotho, and Zimbabwe. Finally, almost half of these countries are facing a local insurgency or a militant threat, including Nigeria, Sudan, Somalia, and Burkina Faso. This now brings me to the end of my presentation. But before signing off, I'd like to leave you with some final thoughts. As indicated in the beginning of our discussion, Africa represents a new wave of COVID-19 at the global level, and with just 30,000 cases across the continent today, we are still in the very early stages of this pandemic in Africa. Yet, as I hope I have demonstrated, we have already seen how this unprecedented event can greatly impact the long-term economic, political, and security health of individual countries. Ultimately, the road ahead is still a long one for all of us, and the challenges will be many. As estimated by the UN Economic Commission for Africa in mid-April, under the best-case scenario, Africa will have 122 million infections, 2.3 million hospitalizations, and 300,000 deaths. The World Health Organization has further warned that Africa could see as many as 10 million cases in the next 3 to 6 months alone, something which is hard to believe as we sit at 30,000 cases today. We at Ex-Africa are monitoring this situation extremely closely, and because we know that this virus will impact all of us in unprecedented ways, our tracking of COVID-19 in Africa is free to everyone. Please do visit our website to access this. As always, if you have any questions on this presentation or any other country risk issue, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us at insight@exafrica.com. I thank you for taking the time to listen to our thoughts and hope you stay healthy and safe during this period.